So I think we can start. I know that somebody has some experiments. So I will start introducing you. Okay. Thank you for dear aficionados of the Journal Club. Today we have Veronique Mayborg presenting us a paper on a model of the basics, an animal model and a simulation model of long QT syndrome. So something that is both inherited and acquired, as you might know, and it puts at risk of lethal ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation. This is interesting. It's a model of acquired long QT syndrome. And well, it contains a lot of information about how to interpret areas of initiation and mechanism of initiation of Torsades de Pointes, which I'm sure Veronique will explain to you much better than I will ever can. So Veronique, thank you very much. I will leave the floor to you. And as usual, the field is interactive. So if you have, I think you can still raise your hand in case you have a question. If Veronique, if it's okay with you to interrupt your presentation, if somebody has a question.
Because I won't be really paying attention to hands raising, I think. Okay. I might not see that. So shout out if you have a question. Well, the reason why I chose this paper is that well, I'm interested in the mechanism of Torsades de Pointes. We also performed a study like 2 years back, I think, together also with Jason with some simulation work. But that was more on the maintenance of the torsade. And there's still a lot to investigate about the initiation. Well, if you told that long QT has been associated with Torsades de Pointes, which can be lethal. And it has been thought for a long while that it is mainly that the arrhythmia is mainly initiated by triggered activity, and that the long-lasting episodes might be more reentrant. But the initiation, the real initiation, and how the first ectopic beat leads to the arrhythmia is unknown. It has been shown in isolated cells that long action potential durations, which is also seen in the long QT syndrome, leads to EADs on cell level. I kind of assume that everyone knows what long QT syndrome is. So you have the inherited disease that is due to a mutation in certain ion channels, but you also have the acquired one, and that is because of drugs. And mainly it is the drugs that block the IKR channel, so the rapid activating repolarizing current. And they quite often see it with the stressor of hypokalemia or bradycardia. So it has been shown on cell level that long APDs lead to early after depolarizations. But how these cellular early after depolarization lead to tissue EADs or the PVC is rather unknown. And it has been suggested as well that the perimeter ventricular complex arises close to the APD gradient. Also in whole heart experiments, they show that. And thereby the question arises whether the EAD or the PVC is mediated, whether the PVC is EAD mediated or whether the voltage gradient has a larger role in that. And Anselevich has been showing that it might be based on the mechanism of phase 2 reentry, because if you have a high voltage gradient, as you see in this action potential graph on the right, if you have from top to down a very high dispersion in action potential duration, then the difference in voltage might give a current that can initiate a second action potential in the area with a short action potential duration. However, to create such large heterogeneity in repolarization, you need a kind of uncoupling of tissue. But to conduct current from a long action potential area to a short action potential area, you actually need a good conduction. So it's a bit difficult to explain how you can have both at the time a large dispersion in action potential duration and propagation by this gradient. But the authors were, they put their aim to examine the initiation mechanisms of the PVCs that occur in a long QT model, mainly focused on how the gradient in APD and voltage can help in creating PVCs. So they did a Langendorf perfusion of rabbit hearts, in which they created a V block, I think because they really want to pace it in their own rhythm without interference of a sinus rhythm. And they performed then optical mapping of the membrane voltage by using Rod2 and the calcium transients by using RH237. And they added the blebbistatin to avoid artifacts of contraction. And they did measurements at baseline, and after they created long QT by giving E4031, which is a IKR blocker, and they added the 50% potassium magnesium solution, but they made the potassium concentration lower, I think, to mimic the hypokalemia, which is normally seen. And they had different groups. In the first 3 groups, they started at baseline with 3 different pacing sequences, and then they added the IKR blockade to mimic the long QT syndrome. And in some of the experiments, they also added nifedipine, which is a calcium blocker, to investigate the calcium current more intensively. This will come later. So they started just by looking at what happens if they induce the long QT syndrome. So they add the IKR blockade, and then they directly see that the number of PVCs and TDPs increased. So at the right upper graph, you see the percentage of hearts that got PVCs or TDPs. And they showed that, well, this is high, but I don't know how it was at control. They say it's significantly different, but I was a bit, I would like also to know how these were in control conditions where there's no APD prolongation. So then they showed that if they are in this long QT situation, in B you see a pseudo EKG where they see a PVCs occurring. I had some difficulties to really understand it, but because I thought that the sharp spikes were pacing spikes, but these are not, I think. These are QRS complexes with a little T wave. So in the first squared, there's no PVC, but in the second one, there is a QRS on top of the T wave. So there are a lot of PVCs in this tracing, and they compared a non-PVC beat with a PVC beat. And what they showed is that if you have no PVC, then you have an action potential duration, which is a bit longer in a certain area. And with the PVC, this area become more prolonged in its action potential duration, and the PVC arises close to this area. So on the left, you see my marker, I hope. I will change my. So here you see the gradient in repolarization, or the APD. And they say that the earliest activation come close to this border APD. Well, then it kind of implies that this APD border is important. And they show again here, if they digged into the PVCs they mapped on the epicardium, which were 31 PVCs, which are actually 13% of all the PVCs they mapped. So there was a majority of PVCs that occurred endocardially or at sites that they couldn't map. But what they found is that indeed they have, again, a large dispersion in action potential duration. So there's a large gradient. And the activation of the PVC occurs close to this gradient. Well, then I realized that this very long APD in yellow is actually the timing of the PVC. So the activation of the PVC occurs before the end of the APD. So I had, it's two action potentials. Yeah. So it's a bit, how you say that? It's a bit, it gives a wrong presentation about APD differences, because this APD is just because there are two APDs included and not because the difference in APD is there. Although I believe that this area would be longer, but not that much longer. So the gradient may be a little bit less. Anyway, they really want to see whether the voltage gradient matters rather than the APD dispersion. So they zoomed in on the end of the action potential with the EADs and the start of the PVC. And you see that in this plot a bit enlarged, and they focused on the voltages at the peak of the EAD, so at the blue line. And then they see indeed there's a voltage gradient, and close to that gradient, the activation also occurs earliest. And when they measured the time of the peak EAD towards the first activation, so the first upstream of the PVC, then they showed a certain timing. But if they took the moment where the voltage gradient was the largest, they say that this time is closer to the occurrence of the steepest upstroke. And with this, they kind of imply that apparently the voltage gradient is more important for the earliest upstroke of the PVC rather than the peak of the EAD.
But the peak of the EAD cannot be during the time of the maximum voltage gradient.
Yeah, I would say so. And a voltage gradient in this case only is created because of the EAD, and that it's not at the same time at the peak. Well, that is maybe because it has to conduct to area that it can capture a tissue that can be re-excited. So I had a bit difficult to really understand what they try to imply. But in the end, they said they really want to make the distinction between the dependence on EAD itself or the voltage gradient. So that's what they also try to show in this most right lower graph, is that the peak of the voltage gradient was much less if there were no PVCs occurring compared when there were PVCs occurring. But the PVCs occurred maybe only when there is an EAD. So they could not uncouple them. So I was a bit wondering whether they couldn't have shown the action potentials in which the EADs occurred, but there was no PVC following and how this voltage gradient was then. I actually expected the voltage gradient is then also lower, because to get a new PVC, you need to have enough current to trigger the action potential. Well, in the supplemental material, they showed also the voltage gradient at this largest gradient moment. So they had the non-PVC and the PVC area, and at the timing where the gradient was the largest, they showed the gradient map, and then indeed the gradient was the largest at the site where also the PVC occurred. But well, this is no proof that a voltage gradient matters more than the EAD, because they could not distinct it. But therefore they went to a computational model to allow the distinction between an EAD or a voltage gradient. Although I think they, based on these data, they already suggest that the EAD did not directly trigger the PVC, but it's the voltage gradient which is not supported in this matter. So then they went to the computational model, and there they modeled a 2D tissue with half of it a long action potential duration by reducing the conductivity for conductance for the IKR and IKS, and the other half is a normal action potential duration. Well, you can see that it changes the action potential duration. And then they applied the S1 stimuli on the left of the tissue, and they performed S2 stimulations to mimic an EAD-like event, and thereby they actually could change the voltage gradients rather than having a real EAD. The other thing is that they, to control the repolarization gradient, they said that they also modulated the tissue conductivity globally. But I think this is an important thing, because in phase 2 reentry, as I told you in the beginning, it's important to realize that you can only get these large APD gradients if you have uncoupled tissue, but that you need coupled tissue to get the electronic current initiating the PVC. So by changing this, they play a little bit more than what is physiologically, I think.
How much was it modulated?
They don't say anything about that. So they don't even say what the level was that they arrive at.
Jason, how much did you change to your conductivity?
You're a little broken up. Can you repeat that?
People that change tissue conductivity in the entire preparation. Did you do that also when you model for sample plant?
No, when we did it, we did not. When we modified the baseline of anything, it was always through the repolarization. This is kind of a gritty way of coupling the tissue. We also didn't have these. I mean, yeah, we did have this abrupt, but they're just, you know, the electrotonic influences across the two just change.
Yeah.
That's all they're doing. But by reducing the conductivity as well, you're probably promoting some slow conducting action potentials and stuff too. I don't know what that is an impact on the next figures, but that would be what I see coming up next. Will probably determine whether I agree or not.
Yeah. Well, indeed, they modeled the reduction of repolarizing current. So they reduced the IKR and IKS by back to 10% of what is normal. So they have a prolonged action potential, a high repolarization gradient, and then they see that if they do this S2 pacing, that they can get capture. And they couldn't get capture if they had a little bit less gradient. So they modeled it back to 20%, then there was less gradient in repolarization, and they were not able to capture by the S2 simulation. And then they measured the different components during the simulations. And what they see that is, if you go, if I go back, you see this yellow dot in the graph. These are the sites that they measure the different components. So here they show the membrane voltage, and then black is the most right part, and the red is the most left part. So you see a depolarized cell and a non-depolarized cell. And that's because of the prolonged action potential. And then at time, it's very small, 700, the S2 was given, and then I can see that there is propagation of an action potential. And it leads to a calcium transient in the black curve, but not in the others. It's the intracellular calcium, but the calcium transient was there in the black and the brown curve, which are more close to the normal APD tissue, and there was much less in the prolonged APD region. And when they looked at the sodium current, they only see that in the black. And from this, they kind of assume that because here you see even in the brown curve still some calcium and no sodium in the brown, that the capture is mainly driven by calcium. But well, that can also be only just because the membrane voltage is right, rather than that there is a large dispersion in voltage.
The left part has not repolarized, so the sodium channels are inactivated.
Yeah. Yeah,
And therefore it is not dependent on calcium, of course.
yeah. Which is likely, but it's not directly showing, I think, that it is because of, well, yeah, here they show that it is dependent on voltage gradient, because when they have a smaller gradient, then they could not induce. But it has also a lot to do about, no, yeah. Okay, so voltage gradient matters, and calcium is thereby a major factor. The only question that I had is that I don't know whether conductivity was similarly modeled in these. I expect so, but they don't mention anything so. So from this data, they said it supports the conclusion that electrotonic triggering by steep voltage gradients in the tissue is the mechanism for the PVC initiation that they observe experimentally. Okay, then they go back to the model, because then they think, well, if calcium is that important, how did it look in our experiments? And then they went back to their optical mapping, and they defined regions across the border of APD dispersion. So region 1 is in the long APD region. Region 2 is the transition, and 3 is in the short action potential duration. And what they show here then is that, well, you see the transition in EADs and the PVC occurring. And they wanted to show how the activation timing occurs, and that is shown in this B graph, where they put the activation time on the x-axis and the distance in this white line across the y-axis. And the red are the ones in region 2, so they are really at the border of APD gradient. Where they show that the activation of the PVC is simultaneously, more or less, whereas the activation in the short action potential duration area is quicker. Therefore, you get more spread of activation timings. And in the area that has a long action potential duration, there's also a spread in activation, but with a lower conduction velocity, which is kind of logical if you assume that you are still in the repolarizing phase of an action potential. Then conduction is also less fast. They showed this in another way to show that the dVdt of the action potential, the upstroke, how that is related to the membrane potential at that moment. And then they show actually that the more depolarized your potential is, the lower the dVdt, which is also, well, no, it's explainable also by the sodium channel availability, I think. Because if you have these curves in which you have the current of this is a graph of the kinetics of a sodium channel. So if you have the current on the y-axis and the voltage on the x-axis, then you can see how much current will flow if you are at a certain membrane potential. And this curve is the inactivation. So at the moment at the end of your action potential, if you are at well, we start from here. If you are depolarized, if you are still at a high level of your membrane voltage, then there's less current available, like towards 0. And the more repolarized you are, the more well, current will be available, which helps in the dVdt upstroke. Well, what did they show here? Yeah, it's a kind of showing the numbers in another way. So it doesn't say anything about whether it's calcium or not, but they coupled this to a supplemental figure in which they try to show that how the calcium time course is related to the membrane voltage, and I couldn't get the complete point here, but what they said is that the calcium is occurring more or less at the same time as the membrane voltage. And normally, if you have a normal action potential, your calcium is a little bit delayed after your membrane voltage, because you first have your upstroke because of your sodium inflow, and then it triggers the calcium, late type calcium current because of the high membrane voltage. And therefore you normally see a calcium transient that's a little bit later after your upstroke. And in this case, they see this delay not. So it might imply that calcium plays an important role. But yes, it already plays a role in occurring of the EAD. So no. Yeah, so this is what they say. Well, and then they did a series in which they have the Longue-QT syndrome, and they added nifedipine to form a block of the calcium current in a low dose, in such a way that it only blocks the calcium in a little way, so it won't change the action potential duration. Because if you block calcium, it also will shorten your action potential, and that's not what they wanted, because then the voltage gradient is also adapted. So they use a dose of nifedipine, and well, they do it in different experiments at different levels, but the message that they want to show is that if you have a number of hearts with ventricular arrhythmias, which are actually the PVCs and not that much the TDPs, then at baseline there, all the hearts had ventricular arrhythmias, but at the moment that nifedipine was infused, and you see that the ventricular arrhythmias were not there anymore. And if you wash out the nifedipine, it comes back. Well, and it's dose dependent. Oh, did someone ask something? No, I don't think so. Well, in the upper right graph, they showed the calcium transient at these different moments in time when they infused nifedipine. And I think what they wanted to show here is that at the moment that ventricular arrhythmias are abolished because of nifedipine infusion, that the calcium transient is not that much reduced yet. So it's not because of calcium transient reduction leading to shorter action potentials that the arrhythmias are abolished, but it's just blocking the calcium to preventing the PVCs to occur. And that's what they try to also confirm here, that the action potential duration was indeed similar among the different settings. So it's not about action potential differences or dispersion in action potential that the arrhythmias disappeared, but it's mainly the calcium that is blocked. Well, yeah. So the long APD was still there, the voltage gradient was still there, and the EADs were also still observed. But yeah, the arrhythmias were gone. So it suggests the crucial role for calcium to trigger the PVCs. Well, I think that's evident. It's about the conduction that can take place because of the calcium current that's there.
The conductivity.
Yeah, well, no, the reactivation of calcium.
Oh,
It's important to get the EAD transforming into a PVC.
Yeah.
But this still, by this way, they could not still. What? No, sorry. They also wanted to show this, of course, in their modeling work. So they went back to the computational model, and they. Well, here you see again that the PVC can propagate if they do the S2 stimulation, and that it leads to the calcium, L-type calcium peaks over the gradient. And in this case, they say that it's a bit difficult to see. If I zoom in a bit, you see here the blue curve, which is in the right at the border of the APD prolongation, so where the voltage gradient is the largest. They show that there is indeed late type calcium current, but there's no sodium current, which implies that it is mediated by calcium and not that much sodium. And if they go now, I'm losing my, sorry for this. So, and when they start reducing the calcium, then at 0.9 or 95%, they still have capture, but at 90% of calcium, they lose the PVC, so they can't get capture. Well, so it's all mediated by calcium. So they conclude in the end that the PVCs are not directly generated by the EADs, but it's more because of the voltage gradients. Although I think they are quite coupled because the EADs lead to the voltage gradients. do they then think that it can also be induced by just having gradients and action potential duration? I don't know. I think it's difficult to create it still. I think you still need the uncoupling to get APD differences in such a way that you get these voltage gradients. The EADs are more likely to create these kind of voltage gradients.
Yeah, but that's what they say. But not necessarily.
No, but how but do they think then that it might be possible to have APD differences or repolarization differences that create these voltage gradients? Because it feels like they're trying to imply that it's, because for me, it's still coupled. The EAD causes these voltage gradients. How in another way would the voltage gradient be created?
In that case, you say that their conclusion is not supported by the data.
Well, not per se, because it is important to have this voltage gradient, and that leads to calcium activation, that leads to the PVC. But I don't think that, well, maybe if you can create this kind of difference in repolarization timing, that it also might lead to PVCs. Well, I always have to think that this phase 2 reentry is still something that is promoted as an alternative mechanism, but it still feels counterintuitive.
Yeah, well, we've tried to use phase 2 in our experiments by creating large gradients of repolarization. Unfortunately, and we never saw spontaneous.
No.
As far as this phase 2 mechanism. Of course, we did this uncouple those preparations. The question is whether yeah, you need that.
No,
Yeah.
I can imagine.
Because that was my question, is where would you have such a strong uncoupling in the ventricles? I mean, I know people have looked at like transmural differences and things like that, but in long QT, is this a structural thing? You know, like, is it left, right, entirely down the middle? I have no idea. Like, it seems like it's a pretty significant gradient in voltage that needs a very high uncoupling. But in the atria, I could see it happening, but I don't know how in the ventricles. Maybe I'm just naive.
Well, we never saw it indeed. Also within the experiments where we added the IKR blockade in the dogs, in the entire heart, we saw a very strong gradient in repolarization between right and left ventricle. So it appeared to be a gradient along the septum or along the LAD region. But there were not that many PVCs. So,
But was that a smooth gradient though that you're seeing in the experiments? Because in the models and things they're doing is very abrupt. Like, it's like a very fine line of decoupling. But I would imagine in the ventricles it'd be more smooth. You wouldn't really
never get it like that. It's not 1-to-1 because we use an 11x11 grid, which have a distance of 5 millimeters, and it uses 2 electrodes, I think. So you have, it's not 1-to-1 electrode that you see the change in repolarization. It always needs 3. So it's well, you need like a centimeter, I think. And also in the LAD perfusions, which is more able to create a strong gradient, well, we still don't have these sharp gradients as they do.
I guess another question you could answer the modeling in a different way that they didn't do is that how do these gradients look on an ECG, right? So you can compare the different gradients to see if they're even physiologic or look real, because these things are going to make huge differences in what happens in the extracellular potential. So they didn't. I don't know. Maybe they did that in a supplement or something, but
I didn't see that. No.
I just tried to calculate the conduction velocity in those models. Like in figure 5A. I think the height of the square is about 1
2
centimeter.
to 2 centimeters. Oh, no. Oh,
Yeah, I've-
sorry.
yeah.
No, the window of optimal mapping is 2. Sorry. Yeah.
I think it's 5 millimeters to either side. You come up with 1 centimeter per, well, or 20 millimeter per second. That's pretty low.
No, it's 20 millimeters by 20. So then half it. It's
Okay, then it's faster.
Yeah.
No,
right.
Yeah.
Maybe if there's a scar.
Yeah.
Then this is relevant, yeah.
yeah, it is gone.
Well, I was also thinking that the difference between the computational model and the rabbit heart is also the 2D, 3D. And in 3D, you already have the conduction of a current is more difficult because it's spread
Yeah.
3D in, for safety. So in that way, reducing the tissue conductivity in the 2D is okay, right? No, but to mimic the 3D situation, then you can add this in.
Jim Weiss is then you know what it takes. Or it's a simulation of EADs, how many cells you need to have simultaneous
Oh, yeah.
in order to spread to a 3D muscle mass. I think we need about 6,000 so cells to do that, which is a substantial amount. So with a single cell, getting the EAD loads and architectural tissue.
Yeah, that's the presentation. You want to quit it?
Yeah, I can see the.
They're still there.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that they say that calcium might be an attractive treatment, because by giving the calcium blocker, they at the low dose they could abolish the PVCs. Well, that helps to avoid triggering the torsade de pointe. And they even say that if they had in cases where there is a coincidence of the IKR, so the KCNH2 mutation and the CACNA, so the calcium, then they are less sensitive to arrhythmias, which might imply that the calcium block helps to prevent arrhythmias to occur.
Okay. Any questions or comments?
Since you're the experts of LQT, is the L-type calcium channel altered in a lot of these patients? Like, I'm just curious to see.
Well, there is a type of long QT that has indeed the calcium current, but I'm not sure what. Yeah, I think it's a gain of function indeed, because that prolongs your action potential. And I think it might be still interesting also for the initiation conditions, because normally if we talk about the IKR blockade, we talk about the long QT type 2 patients, and they get arrhythmias at the moment of arousal, which is the activation of sympathetic chain. And we have shown that if you activate sympathetic nerves, that you get first a prolongation and then a shortening of action potential, and the prolongation is mainly because of calcium. So in that way, it might be relevant, but
Yeah, I'll have to look at some old studies. There were some old studies by Raymond Winslow doing single cell models of stochastic L-type calcium channel with coupling and all this stuff. Might be interesting to go and look at that again from on my behalf. Because yeah, don't know yet.
Okay. Any more comments?
Or questions? Yeah.
Guido, did this help a bit?
To me, yeah, I mean, I was capable to appreciate, I must say, like 90% of the study. I agree that in theory, the first conclusion is overestimated, because I mean, there is one direction of correlation, but not the other one.
Yeah.
I must say, I didn't understand quite well why usually their AADs peaks around in the rabbit around 300 milliseconds. So I don't understand why the S2 in the model is as 500. Here the model is general mammalian. So
Was it also because they had a cycle length of 2000 milliseconds? So it's 2 seconds. So yeah, it's not that physiological. Also not for a rabbit.
No, absolutely not. So that also puzzles me a little bit. To me, well, I don't want to imply anything. To me, things that sound too strange, they sound like tailored. But maybe, you know, these are protocols that function, especially when you have a total AV block here. So probably is really not to have like a good mapping without a huge stressor. So I can abide to the protocol. In general, is an interesting paper. I agree that the calcium implication is I don't know. The way the story is narrated seems like fake, but whatever works in the end.
Yeah.
The advancement of science is whatever works. Once
Yeah.
it's demonstrated, of course.
Well, you now remind me of something, because they measured all these the PVCs and all these things in cycle length of 2000 milliseconds.
They do.
But they also performed during the protocol stimulation set 350, 1000, and also at intrinsic rhythm.
Mhm.
Should be then ventricular because the AV block
Yeah.
has been initiated. But I was actually wondering if what happened in the intrinsic rhythm if they applied the LongQT model, if there were also PVCs that they could map, and how these were related with the calcium. But well, they didn't say anything about that.
No. This formalin AV block, I suppose it's by injection.
Yeah.
Okay. So who knows where the formalin goes or what damage.
Yeah.
But I mean, for the sake of a model, again.
They said this has not been tested in vivo before. Still, the early PAD measurements with one-phase action potentials in the 80s in relation to competition zone and premature peaks. So this is not entirely true. Also, they mentioned that the first to come up with this hypothesis of the ventricular gradient, or the voltage gradient, was Wellens. But I think Gordon Moe did that 30 years before Wellens. So they're not very accurate in their literature, I'm afraid. And when I look at figure 5, in panel B, the third one, and C, the second one, I think they are identical. I don't understand why this is the case and why they show two identical.
Maybe the color scale is
What do you mean, the A and C?
no A and C.
Yeah. The three.
Maybe the color scale is too.
Right.
Ah, the second figure seems different, at least in the.
This one, and the other one.
Wait, this one and
yellow
ah,
scale. Okay.
these. Yeah, I was also thinking that these were the same.
Oh,
But
these
there's
two.
not that much of difference, huh? Because this is during normal calcium, and this is at 95% of calcium.
Okay.
So it is a little bit different.
Mm.
Maybe a little bit. I don't know what the numbers are here.
No, I don't see it. I'm trying to zoom manually, like by putting the paper next to my eyes, but I can't see it.
Feeling is also a bit weird.
But maybe it's not appreciable.
This one is towards 0.08, this blue line
Okay.
peak, and this one is a little bit lower towards 0.06.
Okay.
Okay. 06. All in all, relatively clear. Yes, this thing about the front of the APD duration, which is calculated considering the PVC. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
This is I mean, it certainly highlights the area where the gradient is created.
Yeah.
I mean, it's better appreciable in the voltage for sure. For sure, in the voltage there is no doubt.
If I may have a small question to you, because I'm not that familiar with this long UT issues. Like, I'm a little bit surprised that on that there is like such a steep repolarization gradient, right? But it doesn't result in some sort of unidirectional conduction block, that the wave really propagates even like towards that tissue that doesn't seem to be really repolarized.
You mean in
If you-
the computational model?
No, in the experimental model.
Yeah.
Actually, the difference between the computational model and the experimental model is that in the experimental model, when there is a PVC, the activation wavefront is perpendicular to the repolarization gradient, but in the computational model, it's parallel with the repolarization gradient. Did I understand it correctly?
Yes, that's how I understand it. And it's very strange because if we don't reflect the entire 2D model, it's strange.
Yeah.
There's no need for a 2D model. Am I correct? Or is it-
I think so.
Sorry, I don't hear Ruben very well, but yeah, basically like the modeling, in the modeling part, the wavefront, goes, it's like is parallel with the gradient, with the repolarization gradient. But in the experimental model, you can see that when you compare that strange APD map, and then right next to it there's the activation map, it's obvious that the wavefront propagates along the repolarization gradient. So it's like the wavefront actually perpendicular to it.
I agree. This is the only way to get reality.
So this,
Yeah.
this, to curve around.
Mhm. Yeah, it doesn't look like curving around it. It kind of goes with it. That I found it quite striking.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. You want to sum up, Guido, or close?
Yeah, sure. If there are no other comments, yes, we can close up. Oh, we're right on time. So thank you very much, everyone, Veronica, to have presented this interesting paper and everybody to have participated to this lively discussion. With last comment from Vladimir, that for me is like a little bit of a cliffhanger. I would like to know what is the answer to that. And our next appointment is the 3rd of April, so in 2 weeks. And I will try. I'm not sure we have a speaker, but I will think I will push an invited speaker that was supposed to be in June into April. I don't think it will be a problem for him. Otherwise, metabolism. Sorry.
Right,
Or I
so-
can, I have, would you like something about PFA, about electroporation? Maybe I can find a speaker for electroporation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, electroporation it is. I will ask this other speaker. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care. See you in 2 weeks.
Bye.
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 Thank you.